All right, let's jump into another deep dive. We are looking at what happened when President Trump put a freeze on federal funding back in early 2025.
Yeah.
And we've got this NBC Chicago article that really shows just how crazy things got. It's,
Yeah.
obviously a big policy change, but it also caused some serious legal fights, some pretty strong opinions, and a lot of people wondering what it all means, especially for everyday Americans.
You hit it right on the head. This is way more than just some boring policy talk. It really digs into how power works in our government and shows some pretty big differences in what people believe.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. President Trump put out this order to stop federal grants, and it's supposed to happen super fast, like within a day of him saying so.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fast.
And the freeze was supposed to last at least 10 days. But here's the thing. The order came with this memo that seems like it's meant to get a reaction.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Intrigued.
So this memo, it specifically calls out, quote, Marxist equity, transgenderism, and Green New Deal social engineering policies.
Mm-hmm.
So using that kind of language right away is like a challenge, framing the whole freeze as this fight against certain ideologies.
That's for sure.
And the reaction, it didn't take long. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, he came out swinging, calling the order, quote, illegal,
Yeah.
and saying that the administration was trying to trick the public.
Ah.
I was actually pretty surprised by how strong Pritzker's reaction was. What do you think was behind, like, that kind of strong language?
Well, think about it. You're a governor, and all of a sudden you get this big federal order that could mess up funding for important programs in your state.
Oh, yeah.
You probably feel kind of blindsided too, right?
Yeah.
I think Pritzker's reaction is probably coming from a few main worries. First, he's questioning if this is like the president going too far with his power. Did President Trump overstep his boundaries by putting out such a broad order? Second, the fact that the states didn't know about this before it happened, before the freeze, just made everything more chaotic and confusing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And Pritzker wasn't just talking.
Right.
Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul, he joined a lawsuit against the freeze, taking the fight right to court.
Wow. Okay.
So this legal challenge, it brings up this really interesting question about, like, who controls the money? The lawsuit argued that Congress, not the president, has the final say on how federal money is spent.
That makes sense.
And then, and get this, a judge actually put a temporary stop to the freeze
Really?
until they get a full hearing. This back and forth just shows how the different parts of our government can keep each other in check.
Yeah, the checks and balances.
Exactly. I can only imagine how crazy it must have been for state agencies trying to figure out what was going on.
Oh, yeah.
The NBC article even called it a mad scramble.
Oh, man. I
Yeah.
bet.
So you're in charge of these programs that people depend on, and then suddenly you don't know if you'll have the money to keep them going. That lack of clarity from the federal government, I mean, it must have been super stressful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just to make things even more wild, on the same day that the freeze was announced, the Medicaid portal system crashed nationwide.
Whoa, hold on.
Yeah,
That's a pretty big coincidence, don't you think?
I know.
I mean,
Do you think that was just a coincidence?
millions of people rely on Medicaid for their health care.
Oh, yeah,
So any problem with that system can have huge consequences.
totally.
Was it just a tech issue? Or was there more to it? The timing is definitely suspicious.
Right.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
Yeah, and to make it even more confusing, the White House said the outage had nothing to do with the freeze. But Governor Pritzker, he wasn't buying it at all. It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle, but we don't have all the pieces.
Yeah, I got it. In these kinds of political fights, information becomes like a weapon, and it's hard to tell what's true and what's not. It's important to remember that we're only getting one side of a complicated story, and there might be more to it than we see right now.
Okay, that's a really good point. So let's try to figure out what we do know about what programs were actually at risk and which ones were safe. The article says the freeze could have affected a bunch of areas, like medical research, the EPA, even school lunches.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's telling that they picked those specific programs, the ones that are often seen as part of more progressive agendas. It makes you think that maybe the freeze wasn't just about saving money, but also about pushing back against certain policies.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like they're trying to make a statement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like they froze everything. Some big programs like Medicare, Social Security, food stamps, loans for small businesses, Head Start, and help with rent, those weren't touched.
That's a really interesting approach. It seems like they're trying to do this balancing act, you know? Aiming for fiscal conservatism, but also trying not to hurt vulnerable people too much. It's a tough thing to do, and it's clear that some of these choices are way more controversial than others.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Especially the school lunches thing. That caused a lot of debate. I remember that Rep. Rich McCormick, he defended the idea of freezing school lunch funding.
Really?
Yeah, he actually said kids should get summer jobs instead of relying on free lunches.
Ugh.
I mean, that's a pretty bold thing to say.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
I mean, McCormick's statement shows a certain way of thinking about social welfare. The idea is that people should be responsible for themselves and that maybe the government shouldn't help so much. But that often clashes with the idea that we need a strong safety net to help families, especially the ones struggling to make ends meet.
So it's like we're seeing these two different ways of thinking clashing in a very real way, and it could affect millions of people. It makes you wonder, what was really behind this freeze? Was it just about saving money, or was there something more going on?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's something we'll keep digging into as we look closer at this whole situation. You know what's really interesting about this whole thing?
What's that?
It's almost like, even though it was temporary, this whole episode became a test of what people really believe.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like it forced everyone to think about what they think the government should be doing.
Exactly. Some people might see the freeze as this bold move to cut down on spending, but others might see it as an attack on important programs. And that tension, that's like in every part of this story.
It's like with the school lunches thing. You have McCormick saying people should be responsible for themselves, and then you have others saying a strong safety net is like the government's job.
Mhm.
That argument's been going on forever.
And it goes right to the heart of what we care about as a country. Do we focus on everyone taking care of themselves? Or do we think it's important to help those who need it? Those aren't easy questions, and this freeze order really brought them up.
Yeah, and it also makes me think about how news and information gets twisted during these political battles. We were talking about how the White House and Governor Pritzker had totally different takes on that Medicaid outage.
Right, and that's a perfect example of how information can be like a tool to change how the public sees things. It can be really hard to know what's actually going on, especially when you have different sides telling different stories.
It's like we're always getting hit with so much information, but it's not always easy to know what's true.
That's why it's so important to be careful about what we believe.
Hmm.
We need to know if someone is biased, look for proof of what they're saying, and think about different points of view before we decide what we think.
It feels like we're almost detectives, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
Trying to find clues and separate fact from fiction. You mentioned earlier that we're only seeing one side of this whole thing.
Mm.
What else do you think might be happening behind the scenes?
Well, one thing to remember is that this freeze order didn't just come out of nowhere. It's part of this bigger political fight with different groups wanting different things for the country.
So it wasn't just about these specific programs. It was about sending a message.
Exactly. And that message, it really connects with certain people, the ones who think the government's gotten too big, too involved, and wastes too much money. They see the freeze as a way to cut back the government and be more responsible with money.
But then there's the other side. The people who see it as an attack on programs that people really need. For them, it's not about some idea. It's about what actually happens to families and communities, especially the people who are struggling the most.
And that's where things get really tricky because it's not just two sides fighting. There are a lot of gray areas, details, and things that get lost when everyone's just arguing.
Yeah, it makes you realize that these things are rarely so simple. There are good points on both sides, and it's important to try to understand those different points of view.
I agree. And even though a judge stopped the freeze for now, the real problems haven't gone away. This case could go on for years, and the argument about the government, welfare, and being responsible with money, that'll probably go on even longer.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to think about. So for anyone listening, what stands out to you the most in all of this? What really hits home for you?
Maybe it's the legal fight over who controls the money or how this could affect programs that you or someone you know relies on, or maybe it's about the different beliefs at the heart of this whole thing.
Whatever it is, it's clear that this freeze, even though it stopped, really got to people. It showed some of the big problems we have in our society and made us face some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and what we believe in.
Yeah, it really makes you think, politics isn't just something happening far away in Washington. It affects all of us.
Absolutely. And this whole thing with the funding freeze just shows how everything's connected.
Yeah, like decisions made by the federal government, they can impact the whole country.
Yeah.
Everything from science research to those school lunches we talked about, even the systems we need for healthcare.
Speaking of being connected, I keep thinking about that Medicaid outage.
Yeah.
How the timing, whether it was on purpose or not,
Yeah.
just made all the confusion and uncertainty around the freeze even worse.
That's a really good point. It makes you wonder, are the systems we rely on for important things, like, are they really as strong as we think? What happens if there is a real crisis? Are we ready for things to go wrong, especially if it's because of political
So it's
reasons?
kind of scary. It's
Yeah.
easy to just assume these systems will always work until something like this happens.
Right.
It's like a wake-up call,
Yeah.
reminding us to pay more attention, get more involved, and maybe even be more ready for the unexpected.
This whole deep dive has been like peeling back layers of an onion.
Oh, yeah.
We started with what seemed like a simple news story about this funding freeze.
Right.
But the more we looked into it, the more we found all these complicated issues about power, the role of government, and the values that shape our society.
Yeah, those layers, they aren't going away anytime soon. You said this case could go on for years, and that bigger debate about what the government should be doing and all these social programs, that's probably going to keep going even longer.
Yeah, it probably will. That's why it's so important to stay informed, talk about these things, and really look at them from different sides. It's not about finding easy answers or picking a side.
Yeah.
It's about really understanding what's going on and how it affects everything around us.
It reminds us that we all have a part to play in this,
Mm.
not just watching from the sidelines, but actually getting involved in shaping the future we want.
That's a great way to put it. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
Before we go, I want to leave you with one last thing to think about. We've talked a lot about the tension between different parts of the government, those clashing beliefs, and how tricky it is to make policies. But in the end, it's important to remember that these are systems made and run by people.
Right. So the big question, the one that sticks with me, is how do we as individuals navigate these systems and make our voices heard in a way that really makes a difference?
That's a great question, and something I hope everyone listening will think about, because understanding how these systems work, how power is used, and how to get involved effectively, that's all really important for building the kind of society we want.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those brains working.